Coosaw River, South Carolina, January 9th, 1863. Dawn had not broken yet. The water was black. The USS Planter sat anchored near the western bank, waiting. Robert Smalls stood on deck watching the tree line. He had been watching for 3 hours. He knew this river. He knew how the Confederate forces moved through it. He knew which channels they used, which routes they trusted. He had piloted Confederate ships through these waters before the war, before he stole the Planter and escaped to Union lines. That knowledge made him valuable to the Union Navy, but it did not make him respected. Not by everyone. Captain William Stokes arrived at 5:30 that morning. United States Army, 38th Regiment Massachusetts Volunteers, white, 41 years old, career officer. He came aboard the Planter with 60 soldiers and a direct order from General Rufus Saxton. Stokes was leading a raid on a Confederate supply depot 12 miles upriver. The depot stored ammunition, rifles, and medical supplies. Intelligence said it was lightly defended. The plan was simple. Take the Planter upriver under darkness. Land the troops. Destroy the depot. Get out before Confederate reinforcements arrived. Stokes had been told that Robert Smalls would pilot the ship. He had not been told why. And from the moment he stepped on deck, it was clear he did not care. Stokes looked at Robert Smalls and said nothing. He turned to the Union naval officer overseeing the operation, Lieutenant Commander Harris. Harris gestured toward Robert Smalls and said, "Captain Stokes, this is Robert Smalls. He will be piloting your transport. He knows these waters better than anyone we have." Stokes glanced at Robert Smalls. His expression did not change. He said, "I was told we would have an experienced pilot." Harris said, "You do." Robert Smalls has navigated Confederate and Union vessels through this river for years. He has tactical knowledge of every channel, every sandbar, every Confederate position. Stokes looked back at Harris. He said, "I requested a naval officer." Harris said, "Robert Smalls is your best option." Stokes said nothing for a moment, then he said, "Fine, let us get this over with." The Planter left the dock at 6 o'clock. The soldiers sat below deck. Stokes stood near the helm, arms folded, watching Robert Smalls. Robert Smalls did not acknowledge him. He kept his eyes on the water. The river was narrow here, lined with marsh grass and cypress trees. The current moved fast. One wrong turn and the ship would run aground. Stokes watched for 5 minutes. Then he spoke. "How long have you been doing this?" Robert Smalls did not turn around. He said, 8 years. Stokes said, "And how many combat operations have you piloted?" Robert Smalls said, "This will be my 14th since joining the Union." Stokes smiled, a cold smile. He said, 14. That is not many." Robert Smalls said nothing. Stokes continued, "I have led 42 combat operations. 42. I have been under fire more times than I can count. I have seen men panic. I have seen men freeze. I have seen men make bad decisions because they are afraid. Have you been under fire before?" Robert Smalls turned his head slightly. He said, "Yes, sir." Stokes said, "And did you freeze?" Robert Smalls looked back at the water. He said, "No, sir." Stokes said, "We will see." The river widened as they moved north. The sun started to rise behind them. Stokes walked to the railing and looked at the shoreline. He said, "How much longer?" Robert Smalls said, 2 hours if the current holds." Stokes said, 2 hours. That is too long. We should have left earlier." Robert Smalls said, "We left at the correct time. The tide is with us now. If we had left earlier, we would be fighting the current." Stokes turned and looked at him. He said, "I did not ask for your analysis. I asked how much longer." Robert Smalls said, 2 hours, sir." Stokes shook his head. He said, "I do not know why the Navy insists on using civilians for military operations. This is not a cargo run. This is combat. When the shooting starts, I need someone who understands orders, not someone who thinks they know better." Robert Smalls did not respond. The Planter reached the target area at 8:15. The Confederate supply depot sat on the eastern bank. A small wooden structure, 2 guard towers, maybe 20 soldiers visible. Stokes gathered his men on deck. He pointed to the depot and said, "We land there, quick assault. Burn the structure, take what we can carry, no delays. We have 30 minutes before Confederate forces from the fort downriver realize we are here. Understood?" The soldiers nodded. Stokes turned to Robert Smalls. He said, "Get us to shore." Robert Smalls looked at the shoreline. He said, "Captain, I recommend we land north of the depot. The water is deeper there. We can get closer without running aground. If we land directly in front of the depot, we risk getting stuck." Stokes stared at him. He said, "I gave you an order. Land us in front of the depot." Robert Smalls said, "Sir, the tide is dropping. If we land there, we may not be able to pull back." Stokes stepped closer. He said, "Are you refusing an order?" Robert Smalls said, "No, sir. I am telling you the risk." Stokes said, "And I am telling you to follow my command. You are a pilot, not a strategist, not an officer. You steer the ship where I tell you to steer it. Do you understand?" Robert Smalls looked at him. He said, "Yes, sir." The planter moved toward the shore directly in front of the depot. The water turned shallow. The hull scraped against mud. The ship slowed. Stokes said, "Closer." Robert Smalls said, "Sir, we are at the limit." Stokes said, "I said closer." Robert Smalls turned the wheel. The ship lurched forward. The hull hit solid ground. The ship stopped. Stokes smiled. He said, "See? No problem." He turned to his men. He said, "Move." The soldiers jumped off the side of the ship and waded through shallow water to the shore. They rushed toward the depot. Gunfire erupted immediately. The Confederate guards had been waiting. The assault lasted 12 minutes. Stokes and his men overwhelmed the guards. They set fire to the depot. Smoke rose into the sky. Stokes stood near the burning structure and watched his men load supplies onto the ship. He looked satisfied. Then one of his lieutenants ran up to him. He said, "Captain, we have a problem. Confederate reinforcements are coming from the south. At least 80 men, maybe more. They will be here in 20 minutes. Stokes said, "Then we leave now." The lieutenant said, "Sir, the ship is stuck." Stokes turned and looked at the planter. The ship sat motionless, stuck in the mud. The tide had dropped. Stokes ran back to the shore. He climbed onto the ship and found Robert Smalls at the helm. He said, "Why are we not moving?" Robert Smalls said, "We are aground. The tide dropped while your men were on shore." Stokes said, "Then get us off." Robert Smalls said, "I cannot. The water is too shallow. We need to wait for the tide to rise." Stokes said, "How long?" Robert Smalls said, 4 hours. Stokes stared at him. He said, 4 hours? Confederate forces will be here in less than 20 minutes. Robert Smalls said, "I warned you about this, sir." Stokes grabbed Robert Smalls by the shoulder. He said, "You did this on purpose." Robert Smalls did not move. He said, "I followed your orders, sir. You told me to land here. I told you the risk. You ordered me to do it anyway." Stokes let go. He turned and looked at the shoreline. His men were still loading supplies. He said, "Can you move this ship or not?" Robert Smalls said, "Not until the tide rises." Stokes said, "Then we are trapped." Robert Smalls said nothing. Stokes paced the deck. He said, "This is your fault. You should have refused the order. You should have insisted." Robert Smalls said, "You told me I was just a pilot. You told me to follow orders. I did." Stokes stopped pacing. He looked at Robert Smalls. His face was red. He said, "Do not play games with me." Robert Smalls said, "I am not playing games. I am telling you what you told me. You wanted me to follow orders. I did. Now we are here." The sound of gunfire came from the south. Stokes turned. He could see movement in the trees. Confederate soldiers, moving fast. Stokes said, "How many men do we have on the ship?" The lieutenant said, 40. The rest are still on shore. Stokes said, "Call them back. Now." The lieutenant shouted to the men on shore. They started running back toward the ship, but the Confederate forces were closer. Gunfire intensified. 2 Union soldiers fell. The rest made it to the ship and climbed aboard. Stokes said, "Return fire." The Union soldiers took positions on deck and fired toward the tree line. The Confederate soldiers fired back. Bullets hit the side of the ship. Stokes crouched behind the railing. He looked at Robert Smalls. He said, "We need to move." Robert Smalls said, "I told you we cannot move." Stokes said, "Then what do we do?" Robert Smalls said, "You are the commanding officer. You tell me." The firefight continued for 10 minutes. The Confederate forces were not advancing. They were staying in the trees, firing from cover, keeping the Union forces pinned down. Stokes realized they were waiting for more reinforcements, waiting for artillery. Once that arrived, the planter would be destroyed. Stokes looked at Robert Smalls. He said, "Is there any way to get this ship moving?" Robert Smalls said, "There is one option." Stokes said, "What?" Robert Smalls said, "We lighten the ship, remove weight, throw cargo overboard, reduce the draft. It might give us enough clearance to pull back." Stokes said, "How much weight?" Robert Smalls said, "Everything. Ammunition, supplies, cannons if we have to." Stokes said, "We just risked our lives to get those supplies." Robert Smalls said, "And now you have to choose. Keep the supplies and lose the ship, or lose the supplies and save your men." Stokes stared at him. He said, "You knew this would happen." Robert Smalls said, "I warned you." Stokes stood up. He shouted to his men, "Throw everything overboard, ammunition, supplies, everything." The soldiers looked at him. One of them said, "Sir?" Stokes said, "Do it now." "That is an order." The soldiers started throwing cargo overboard, crates of rifles, ammunition boxes, barrels of gunpowder. Everything hit the water. The ship lightened. Robert Smalls watched. He said nothing. After 5 minutes, Stokes said, "Is that enough?" Robert Smalls said, "Maybe." He turned the wheel. The engine strained. The ship did not move. Stokes said, "It is not working." Robert Smalls said, "We need more." Stokes said, "There is nothing left." Robert Smalls said, "Yes, there is. The forward cannon." Stokes said, "We need that cannon." Robert Smalls said, "You need to survive." Stokes looked at the cannon. A 12-pound howitzer, standard issue. He turned to his men. He said, "Remove the cannon." The soldiers hesitated. Stokes shouted, "I said remove it. Now." The soldiers unbolted the cannon and pushed it to the side. It fell into the water with a heavy splash. The ship rose slightly. Robert Smalls turned the wheel again. The engine roared. The ship moved, slowly, inch by inch. The hull scraped against the mud. Then it broke free. The planter pulled back into deeper water. Stokes exhaled. He said, "Move. Get us out of here." Robert Smalls said, "Which route do you want me to take?" Stokes looked at him. He said, "What?" Robert Smalls said, "There are 2 routes out of this river. The southern route is faster but takes us past the Confederate fort. The northern route is longer but avoids the fort. Which route do you want?" Stokes said, "I do not know these waters. You do." Robert Smalls said, "I do, but you are the commanding officer. You give the orders. I follow them." Stokes stared at him. The gunfire continued. Bullets hit the water near the ship. Confederate soldiers were moving closer to the shoreline. Stokes said, "What do you recommend?" Robert Smalls said, "I recommend the northern route. It is safer." Stokes said, "How much longer?" Robert Smalls said, 45 minutes longer. Stokes said, "And the southern route?" Robert Smalls said, 15 minutes. "But the fort has artillery. If they see us, they will fire." Stokes said, "Will they hit us?" Robert Smalls said, "I do not know. I have never tried to pass that fort in daylight before." Stokes looked at the shoreline. More Confederate soldiers were arriving. He looked at Robert Smalls. He said, "Can you get us past the fort?" Robert Smalls said, "Maybe." Stokes said, "Maybe is not good enough." Robert Smalls said, "Then take the northern route." Stokes said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Take the southern route. Get us home as fast as possible." Robert Smalls turned the ship south. The planter moved downriver. The current was against them now. The ship moved slower. The Confederate fort appeared in the distance. A stone structure on the western bank. 4 cannons visible. Stokes stood next to Robert Smalls. He said, "Can they see us?" Robert Smalls said, "Yes." Stokes said, Are they going to fire? Robert Smalls said, probably. Stokes said, what do we do? Robert Smalls said, you are the commanding officer. You tell me. Stokes looked at him. He said, I am asking for your recommendation. Robert Smalls said, we need to move faster. Stokes said, can we? Robert Smalls said, not with the current against us, unless we lighten the ship more. Stokes said, there is nothing left to throw. Robert Smalls said, then we move as fast as we can and hope they miss. Stokes said, that is your plan? Hope? Robert Smalls looked at him. He said, you did not want my plan before. You wanted orders followed. I followed them. Now we are here. Stokes said, I am giving you command. Get us out of here. Robert Smalls said, I am not an officer. I am just a pilot. You said so yourself. The first cannon fired from the fort. The shell hit the water 50 yards behind the ship. Stokes flinched. He said, they are firing. Robert Smalls said, yes. Stokes said, what do we do? Robert Smalls said, I need you to give me an order. Stokes said, I am giving you full authority. Do what you need to do. Robert Smalls turned the wheel sharply to the left. The ship angled toward the eastern bank. Stokes said, what are you doing? Robert Smalls said, moving closer to the far bank. The fort's cannons have a limited range. If we stay close to the opposite shore, their angle is bad. They will have to elevate their shots. That makes them less accurate. Stokes said, will it work? Robert Smalls said, I do not know, but it is better than staying in the middle of the river. The second cannon fired. The shell overshot the ship and hit the trees on the eastern bank. Stokes said, keep going. The planter hugged the eastern shoreline. The fort fired 3 more times. All shots missed. The ship moved past the fort. Stokes watched the fort disappear behind them. He exhaled. He said, we made it. Robert Smalls said, yes, sir. Stokes turned and looked at him. He said, you could have done that earlier. You could have told me to stay close to the eastern bank from the beginning. Robert Smalls said, you did not ask for my recommendation. You told me to follow orders. Stokes said, I am asking now. What else should I know? Robert Smalls said, the river widens ahead. The current will ease. We will reach Union lines in 1 hour. Stokes said, will we encounter any more Confederate positions? Robert Smalls said, no, we are clear. Stokes nodded. He said, good. They stood in silence for several minutes. Then Stokes spoke. He said, you knew this would happen. You knew we would get stuck. You knew I would have to ask for your help. Robert Smalls said, I knew the tide would drop. I knew the risks. I told you. You did not listen. Stokes said, you should have refused the order. Robert Smalls said, I am not allowed to refuse orders. I am not an officer. You made that clear. Stokes said, you embarrassed me in front of my men. Robert Smalls said, you embarrassed yourself. You assumed I did not know what I was talking about because of who I am. You did not listen to my warnings. You made decisions based on pride, not strategy. That is why we are here. Stokes said nothing. Robert Smalls continued, you asked me if I had ever been under fire. I have, many times. I stole a Confederate warship from Charleston Harbor and escaped to Union lines with my family. I navigated past 5 Confederate forts in the dark. I delivered military intelligence that changed Union naval strategy. I have piloted 14 combat operations for the Union. I know these waters. I know the risks. And I told you what would happen. You chose not to believe me. That is not my fault. Stokes looked at the water. He said I made a mistake. Robert Smalls said, yes, you did. Stokes said I should have listened. Robert Smalls said, yes, you should have. Stokes turned and looked at him. He said, if I give you an order now, will you follow it? Robert Smalls said, that depends on the order. Stokes said, if I ask for your recommendation, will you give it? Robert Smalls said, yes. Stokes said, and if I disagree with your recommendation? Robert Smalls said, then you are the commanding officer. You make the decision, but I will tell you the risks. And I will not be responsible for what happens if you ignore them. Stokes nodded. He said, fair enough. The planter reached Union lines at 11 o'clock. The ship docked. Stokes and his men disembarked. Lieutenant Commander Harris was waiting on the dock. He said, "Captain Stokes, how did the operation go?" Stokes looked at Robert Smalls. Then he looked at Harris. He said, "The depot was destroyed. We took casualties. We lost the supplies, and we barely made it back." Harris said, "What happened?" Stokes said, "I made poor decisions. I did not listen to my pilot." Harris looked at Robert Smalls. He said, "Is that true?" Robert Smalls said, "Captain Stokes ordered me to land in a location I warned him about. The ship became stuck. We were pinned down by Confederate forces. We had to jettison cargo and retreat under fire." Harris said, "And how did you escape?" Stokes said, "Robert Smalls navigated us past a Confederate fort using tactics I did not understand. He saved the ship and my men." Harris said, "I see." Stokes said, "I owe him an apology, and my thanks." Harris looked at Robert Smalls. He said, "Do you accept?" Robert Smalls said, "Yes, sir." Stokes extended his hand. Robert Smalls shook it. Stokes said, "I underestimated you. I will not make that mistake again." Harris dismissed Stokes. The captain left with his men. Harris turned to Robert Smalls. He said, "What really happened out there?" Robert Smalls said, "Exactly what I described." Harris said, "And what did you learn?" Robert Smalls said, "That some officers will not listen until they have no other choice." Harris said, "And do you think Stokes learned his lesson?" Robert Smalls said, "I do not know, but he will remember today." Harris nodded. He said, "Get some rest. You have another operation tomorrow." Robert Smalls said, "Yes, sir." Robert Smalls walked off the dock. He did not look back. He did not think about Stokes. He thought about the next mission, the next river, the next officer who would assume he did not belong, the next time he would have to prove himself. He had done it before. He would do it again, because that was the war he was fighting, not just against the Confederacy, against the system that believed men like him could not lead, could not strategize, could not be trusted. Every mission was another chance to prove them wrong, and he intended to keep proving them wrong until the war ended, or until they finally learned to listen. The report reached General Rufus Saxton that evening. Captain William Stokes had submitted a full account of the Coosaw River operation. The depot had been destroyed. Confederate supplies had been eliminated, but the mission had nearly ended in disaster. Stokes wrote that he had made critical errors in judgment, that he had ignored the warnings of his pilot, that Robert Smalls had saved the ship and the lives of 60 Union soldiers. Saxton read the report twice. Then he called for Lieutenant Commander Harris. Harris arrived at headquarters within the hour. Saxton said, "Is this report accurate?" Harris said, "Yes, sir. I spoke with both Captain Stokes and Robert Smalls. The details match." Saxton said, "Stokes admits he was wrong?" Harris said he does, publicly, in front of his men. Saxton leaned back in his chair. He said, "That is unusual. Most officers do not admit mistakes, especially not about taking advice from a black pilot." Harris said, "Smalls gave him no choice. The ship was stuck. Confederate forces were closing in. Stokes had to ask for help or lose everyone." Saxton said, "And Smalls delivered?" Harris said he did. "He navigated past a Confederate fort under fire. He brought everyone home." Saxton said, "How many operations has Smalls piloted now?" Harris said, 15. "All successful," Saxton said. "And how many times has he been doubted by commanding officers?" Harris said, "Most of them." Saxton said, "That needs to change." 3 days later, Saxton issued new orders. All Union officers operating in South Carolina coastal waters were required to attend a briefing on local navigation and Confederate positions. The briefing would be led by Robert Smalls. It was not a suggestion. It was a command. Officers who refused would be removed from coastal operations. The order was unusual. The Union Army and Navy rarely required white officers to take instruction from black personnel. But Saxton had seen enough. Too many operations had been jeopardized because officers refused to listen. Too many ships had been damaged. Too many men had been put at risk. If Robert Smalls had the knowledge to prevent those failures, then officers would learn from him, whether they liked it or not. The briefing was held on January 14, 1863. 23 officers attended, Army and Navy, captains, lieutenants, and commanders. They sat in a tent near Port Royal headquarters. Robert Smalls stood at the front with a map of the South Carolina coast spread across a table. He did not wait for introductions. He began immediately. He pointed to Charleston Harbor and said, "This is the most heavily fortified position in the Confederacy. 7 major forts, over 100 cannons, minefields in every deep channel. If you attempt a direct assault, you will fail." The officers watched him. Some took notes. Others sat with arms folded. Robert Smalls continued. He pointed to the rivers and said, "The Confederacy moves supplies through these waterways. The Ashley River, the Cooper River, the Stono River. They use shallow draft vessels because they know our larger ships cannot follow. But smaller Union transports can. If you know the channels, if you know the tides, if you know the recognition signals." One officer raised his hand, a Navy lieutenant named Bradford. He said, "How do we know the recognition signals?" Robert Smalls said, "I know them. I piloted Confederate ships for years. I memorized their codes, their whistle patterns, their flag positions." Bradford said, "And those codes have not changed?" Robert Smalls said, "Some have. But I know which ones. And I know how to identify new ones when I see them." Bradford said, "How?" Robert Smalls said, "Because I know how the Confederacy thinks. I know their officers. I know their habits. I know what they will do before they do it." Another officer spoke, an Army captain named Reynolds. He said, "What if you are wrong? What if the codes have changed, and you lead us into an ambush?" Robert Smalls looked at him. He said, "Then you will die. Just like you will die if you ignore my advice and pilot your own ship into a minefield, or run aground at the wrong tide, or approach a fort at the wrong angle." Reynolds said, "That sounds like a threat." Robert Smalls said, "It is not a threat. It is a fact. You are operating in waters you do not understand. I do. You can listen to me, or you can make your own decisions. But if you make the wrong decision, you will not get a second chance." Reynolds said, "And if we listen to you and you are wrong?" Robert Smalls said, "Then you can blame me, but I have piloted 15 operations in these waters, all successful. How many have you piloted?" Reynolds said nothing. Robert Smalls said, "That is what I thought." The briefing continued for 2 hours. Robert Smalls explained every major waterway, every Confederate position, every tactic the Union could use to avoid detection. He spoke clearly. He answered every question. He did not soften his tone. He did not apologize for his knowledge. He told them what they needed to know, and he made it clear that their survival depended on listening. When the briefing ended, most officers left without speaking to him. A few nodded. One shook his hand. General Saxton stayed behind. He walked up to Robert Smalls and said, "How do you think that went?" Robert Smalls said, "Some of them will listen. Most of them will not." Saxton said, "Why?" Robert Smalls said, "Because they do not want to believe that I know more than they do. They want to believe that their rank makes them smarter. Their experience makes them better. But rank and experience do not matter if you do not know the terrain." Saxton said, "Do you think they learned that today?" Robert Smalls said, "Some of them. The ones who almost died will remember. The ones who have not been tested yet will forget." Saxton was right. Within 2 weeks, 3 of the officers who attended the briefing requested Robert Smalls as their pilot for upcoming operations. They had listened. They had learned. But others had not. On January 28, 1863, an Army transport attempted to navigate the Ashepoo River without a local pilot. The commanding officer was Captain Reynolds, the same officer who had questioned Robert Smalls during the briefing. Reynolds believed he could read the charts and navigate the river himself. He was wrong. The transport ran aground within an hour. Confederate forces spotted the stranded ship and opened fire. Reynolds and his men abandoned the vessel and retreated on foot. The ship was captured. 12 Union soldiers were killed. Reynolds survived. He returned to Port Royal and filed a report blaming poor intelligence. He claimed the charts were inaccurate. He claimed the tide schedule was wrong. He did not mention that he had been warned, that Robert Smalls had told him exactly where the sandbars were, that he had been given the information he needed and chose to ignore it. General Saxton read the report. Then he called Reynolds into his office. He said, "You were at the briefing on January 14th. Reynolds said, "Yes, sir." Saxton said, "Robert Smalls explained the Ashepoo River. He told you where the sandbars were. He told you the safe channels. Do you remember that?" Reynolds said, "Yes, sir." Saxton said, "Then why did you ignore his advice?" Reynolds said, "I believed the charts were sufficient." Saxton said the charts were not sufficient. "Robert Smalls told you that. He told all of you? And now 12 men are dead because you refused to listen." Reynolds said nothing. Saxton said, "You are removed from coastal operations. You will be reassigned inland." Reynolds said, "Sir, I request reconsideration." Saxton said, "Denied. You had your chance. You wasted it. Dismissed." Robert Smalls heard about the incident 2 days later. Lieutenant Commander Harris told him during a routine briefing. Harris said, "Reynolds lost a ship on the Ashepoo River." Robert Smalls said, "I know." Harris said, "How?" Robert Smalls said, "Because I told him that would happen if he did not follow the route I described." Harris said, "Saxton removed him from coastal operations." Robert Smalls said, "Good." Harris said, "Do you feel vindicated?" Robert Smalls said, "No. 12 men are dead. I do not feel vindicated. I feel frustrated." Harris said, "Why?" Robert Smalls said, "Because this will happen again. Another officer will ignore my advice. Another ship will be lost. Another group of men will die. And I will still be standing here explaining things that should be obvious." Harris said, "Maybe this will be a lesson. Maybe other officers will learn from Reynolds' mistake." Robert Smalls said, "Some will. Most will not. Because the system does not want to learn from me. It wants to use me when convenient and ignore me when uncomfortable. That is how it works. That is how it has always worked." Harris said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Saxton wants you to pilot another operation. A major one." Robert Smalls said, "When?" Harris said, "February 10th. 3 weeks from now, Confederate ironclad is moving supplies through the Combahee River. Union forces want to intercept it. Saxton specifically requested you." Robert Smalls said, "Who is the commanding officer?" Harris said, "Colonel James Montgomery, 54th Massachusetts Regiment." Robert Smalls said, "I do not know him." Harris said, "He is new to the region, but he has a reputation. Montgomery is aggressive. He does not hesitate, and he listens to his scouts." Robert Smalls said, "Does he listen to Black Scouts?" Harris said, "I do not know, but you will find out." Colonel James Montgomery arrived at Port Royal on February 5th, 1863. He was 46 years old, white, Kansas Jayhawker, abolitionist. He had fought in Bleeding, Kansas before the war. He had led raids against pro-slavery settlers. He had burned plantations. He had freed slaves. He believed in the cause. But that did not mean he trusted black soldiers or black pilots. When Montgomery met Robert Smalls, he shook his hand. He said, "I have heard about you. You stole a Confederate ship." Robert Smalls said, "Yes, sir." Montgomery said, "That takes nerve. I respect that. But this operation is different. We are not sneaking past forts in the dark. We are intercepting an armed ironclad in hostile territory. If you make a mistake, we all die. Do you understand?" Robert Smalls said, "I understand." Montgomery said, "Good. Then let me be clear. I give orders. You follow them. If I ask for your opinion, you give it. If I do not ask, you stay quiet. Can you do that?" Robert Smalls said, "Yes, sir." Montgomery said, "Then we will get along fine." The operation launched on February 10th at 4 in the morning. 3 Union gunboats, 150 soldiers. The target was a Confederate ironclad transporting ammunition and supplies up the Combahee River to a depot near the town of Combahee Ferry. Intelligence said the ironclad would pass through a narrow section of the river at dawn. The plan was to intercept it there, destroy or capture it, then withdraw before Confederate reinforcements arrived. Robert Smalls piloted the lead gunboat. Montgomery stood beside him. The river was dark. The current was slow. The air was cold. Montgomery said, How far to the intercept point? Robert Smalls said, 3 miles. Montgomery said, how long? Robert Smalls said, 40 minutes at this speed. Montgomery said, can we go faster? Robert Smalls said, not safely. The river has submerged logs. If we hit one at full speed, we will damage the hull. Montgomery said, then we maintain this speed. Robert Smalls said, yes, sir. They reached the intercept point at 4:35. The river narrowed. Trees lined both banks. Montgomery positioned the 3 gunboats in a line across the river. He said, when the ironclad appears, we fire immediately. Disable it before it can return fire. Understood? The officers on the other gunboats confirmed. Montgomery turned to Robert Smalls. He said, where will it come from? Robert Smalls pointed upriver. He said, from the north, around that bend. Montgomery said, how much warning will we have? Robert Smalls said, maybe 2 minutes. You will hear the engine before you see it. Montgomery said, 2 minutes. That is not much time. Robert Smalls said, it is enough if you are ready. Montgomery said, we are ready. They waited. 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, no ironclad. Montgomery paced the deck. He said, are you sure it is coming? Robert Smalls said, intelligence said it would pass through here at dawn. Montgomery said, it is past dawn. Robert Smalls said, dawn is not an exact time. It could mean any time between 5 and 6 o'clock. Montgomery said, if it does not show up in the next 10 minutes, we leave. Robert Smalls said, you are the commanding officer. Montgomery said, yes, I am. They waited. At 5:42, Robert Smalls heard it, the low rumble of a steam engine. He said, it is coming. Montgomery said, where? Robert Smalls pointed. He said, around the bend. 30 seconds. Montgomery raised his hand. He shouted to the other gunboats, prepare to fire. The ironclad appeared, a low-profile vessel, armored plating, 2 cannons visible. It moved slowly up the river. Montgomery dropped his hand. He shouted, fire. All 3 gunboats fired simultaneously. Shells hit the ironclad. Sparks flew. Metal screeched. The ironclad returned fire. 1 shell hit the water near the lead gunboat. Another hit the trees on the eastern bank. Montgomery said, reload. Fire again. The gunboats fired a second volley. More hits. The ironclad slowed. Smoke poured from its stack. Montgomery said, one more. The gunboats fired a third time. The ironclad stopped moving. Its engine died. Montgomery said, cease fire. He turned to Robert Smalls. He said, can we board it? Robert Smalls said, yes. But carefully. It might have crew still alive inside. Montgomery said, take us alongside. Robert Smalls maneuvered the gunboat next to the ironclad. Montgomery and 20 soldiers boarded. They found 3 Confederate crew members alive. The rest had been killed or abandoned ship. Montgomery secured the prisoners. He inspected the cargo, ammunition, rifles, medical supplies. He turned to his lieutenant. He said, transfer everything to our ships. We are taking it. The lieutenant said, what about the ironclad? Montgomery said, sink it. They cannot use it if it is on the bottom of the river. The soldiers rigged explosives inside the ironclad. They set a fuse. They returned to the gunboats. Montgomery said, move. Get us out of here. Robert Smalls turned the ship around and headed downriver. 5 minutes later, the ironclad exploded. The blast echoed across the water. Montgomery smiled. He said, that is how you do it. The gunboats returned to Port Royal at 8 o'clock that morning. Montgomery reported to General Saxton. He said, mission successful, ironclad destroyed, supplies captured, no Union casualties. Saxton said, excellent work. Montgomery said, Robert Smalls performed well. He knew the river. He positioned us correctly. He got us out safely. Saxton said, will you request him for future operations? Montgomery said, yes, if he is available. Saxton said, he will be. Montgomery nodded. He said, good. Robert Smalls was cleaning the gunboat when Montgomery approached him. Montgomery said, you did well today. Robert Smalls said, thank you, sir. Montgomery said, I underestimated you when we first met. I thought you were just a pilot who got lucky stealing a ship. I was wrong. You know what you are doing. Robert Smalls said, "Yes, sir." Montgomery said, "I want you to pilot my next operation. Will you?" Robert Smalls said, "If I am ordered to." Montgomery said, "I am not ordering you. I am asking." Robert Smalls looked at him. He said, "Why does that matter?" Montgomery said, "Because I want you to know I respect what you do. You are not just following orders. You are making decisions that keep men alive. That matters." Robert Smalls said, "Yes, sir." "It does." Montgomery said, "So will you?" Robert Smalls said, "Yes, I will." Montgomery extended his hand. Robert Smalls shook it. Montgomery said, "I will see you next time." Robert Smalls said, "Yes, sir." Montgomery walked away. Robert Smalls watched him go. He did not feel satisfied. He did not feel vindicated. He felt tired, because he knew this would happen again. Another officer would doubt him. Another operation would start with skepticism. Another moment would come where he would have to prove himself, again and again and again. It did not matter how many successful missions he completed. It did not matter how many officers thanked him afterward. The next one would still doubt. The next one would still question. The next one would still assume he did not belong. That was the war he was fighting, not just against Confederate forces, against the system that refused to see him as anything more than a former slave who got lucky. He had stolen a warship. He had delivered military intelligence. He had piloted dozens of operations. He had saved lives. He had changed Union strategy. But none of that mattered to the system. The system did not change. It adapted when forced. It acknowledged talent when survival demanded it. But it never truly changed. And Robert Smalls understood that. He had always understood it. That is why he did not celebrate victories. That is why he did not wait for recognition. He simply moved to the next mission, the next river, the next officer who needed to learn the hard way. On February 23, 1863, Robert Smalls received new orders. Another operation, another river, another commanding officer he had never met. He read the orders. He folded the paper. He walked to the dock. The war continued. And so did he. Because that was what survival required. Not hope, not recognition, just persistence. Just the quiet knowledge that every time he proved himself, he made it slightly easier for the next man who looked like him. Slightly harder for the system to ignore. Slightly more difficult for officers to dismiss. That was the real victory. Not the ships he piloted, not the missions he completed, but the slow erosion of the assumption that men like him could not lead, could not strategize, could not be trusted. Every operation was another crack in that assumption. And one day, maybe long after the war ended, that assumption would finally break. Robert Smalls would not live to see it, but he would contribute to it. One mission at a time, one officer at a time, one moment at a time, that was enough. It had to be.